Imagine, if you will, a master predator.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah, so picture a tiger,
Yeah.
right? Like right out of the movie Zootopia.
Oh, right, yeah.
And this is a creature that possesses incredibly complex, highly evolved, and, frankly, lethal capabilities.
Definitely.
In a vast dynamic environment, those high-dimensional instincts, they aren't just useful. They are the absolute baseline requirements for survival.
Right, because she can process like 1,000 environmental variables at once.
Exactly. The shift in the wind, the snap of a twig, the subtle tension in the herd.
Uh.
And here's the catch. Instead of roaming that environment, this specific tiger is forced to sit in a gray, windowless cubicle.
Oh, wow. That sounds miserable.
It is.
Yeah.
She is completely constrained by this mundane, paper-pushing bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And that bureaucracy, it does not want a master predator.
I mean, the system is actually terrified of the predator.
Yes, they just want a standardized, non-threatening, perfectly predictable employee.
Yeah.
They want a domesticated house cat who smiles, doesn't ask questions, and just diligently stamps the forms.
The friction there is just immense.
Right.
What you're describing is this profound, almost violent mismatch between the innate hardware of the individual and the rigid operating environment of the modern institution.
Yeah.
And the toll it takes on the individual who possesses that hardware is devastating.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are pulling apart a fascinating set of essays, personal histories, and systemic analyses today. And they were written by a very specific real-world individual who lives inside that exact friction.
Her name is Christy O'Neill.
Right. She is a Florida-based actuary, she is an autistic and lesbian woman, and she is a master of statistical theory.
Just to ground you in her expertise for a second, she holds a Master of Statistics from the University of Florida.
Which is no small feat.
Not at all. And she has spent 17 years navigating the long horizons, the funding assumptions, and the regime drifts of, public, private, and federal pension systems.
Yeah, we're talking about someone who spends her entire life looking at the mathematical realities of the future.
Exactly. So our mission for you, the listener, is to decode Christie's data set today, but not as a traditional chronological resume.
Right, because that won't help us understand her at all.
No, it won't. We are going to look at it as what she terms a system architecture.
A system architecture. I love that phrasing.
It's brilliant. We want to explore the intense, grinding friction between her master's level expertise in something called ruin theory.
Which we will get into.
Yes, which is the underlying mathematics of how complex systems collapse. We're exploring the friction between that and a corporate world that relentlessly tries to flatten her high-dimensional processing into a standard human resources bucket.
So think about this for a second. Have you ever been in a situation at work where you felt like you were watching a system fail in real time?
Oh, I think everyone has felt that at some point.
Right, like you could vividly see the cracks forming in the foundation. You knew exactly where the project was going to crash, but the entire organization just wanted you to smile, nod, and look at a green dashboard.
To keep tapping the ducks?
Exactly. We are going to explore Christie's pig duck theory today to determine if she and people precisely like her are actually the critical, life-saving signal that corporate noise is desperately trying to suppress.
I want to start by looking at how Christie conceptualizes her own cognitive framework, because it really sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about.
Yeah, let's start there.
She describes her human OS, her internal operating system, as a cross between a hyper-threaded CPU and asynchronous JavaScript.
Okay, I want to translate that for a second because I absolutely love the asynchronous JavaScript analogy.
Go for it.
So for anyone who isn't a web developer or a software engineer, asynchronous JavaScript essentially means the system does not stop and wait for one task to finish before it starts another.
Right, it doesn't block the rest of the page from loading.
Exactly. It doesn't process things in a single polite line. It is firing off multiple requests, processing entirely different streams of data simultaneously, and compiling them dynamically the exact moment the information arrives.
It is true multi-axis processing, and that is the perfect way to visualize it. She operates as what she calls a verified generalist or a sovereign pilot.
Sovereign pilot. That's intense.
It is. And this goes far, far beyond the standard corporate buzzword of multitasking.
Oh, multitasking is usually just rapidly switching your attention back and forth between single tasks, which actually degrades your focus.
Right. You get worse at everything you're trying to do. But Christie is talking about genuine multi-axis capability. And to measure this, she uses a very specific metric she calls the esoteric bite rate.
Okay, wait. Esoteric bite rate sounds a bit like sci-fi jargon.
It kind of does.
What does that actually mean for her on, a random Tuesday morning in a corporate office?
Well, in standard digital terms, bite rate is simply how fast data moves through a connection, right?
Megabits per second, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But esoteric bite rate is the maximum speed and density at which nodes, in this case, human minds, can exchange highly abstract, non-standard data without dropping packets or crashing the conversation. Christie's brain allows for these massive six-braided architectural downloads.
Six-braided?
Yeah, meaning she can take something incredibly micro, like a single tiny glitch in a DoorDash PIN code,
Okay.
and instantly connect it to the meso level of a company's serverless architecture, and then seamlessly tie that observation to the macro level of historical drift and systemic organizational decay.
That is wild.
And she executes this entire sequence in a single, perfectly synchronized thought process.
I think about it like trying to blast a 4K fiber optic video signal through a 1990s dial-up modem.
Yes, that's exactly it.
She has optimized her internal environment for this incredibly high esoteric bite rate. But she doesn't get to work in a vacuum, right? She has to plug that processing power into standard corporate infrastructure.
And the corporate world is a singular access receiver.
Singular access. It is rigidly throttled.
Completely. It is optimizing for one thing and one thing only, which is narrative smoothing.
Narrative smoothing. It wants the story to be simple, linear, and most importantly, safe.
So what happens when that corporate modem encounters Christie's esoteric bite rate?
It can't handle it.
Right. When she sits in a morning stand-up meeting and tries to trace, say, the epigenetic legacy of chemical stressors through generational trauma, and how that impacts long-term actuarial tables.
The system experiences a massive buffer overflow.
Yeah.
The manager's brain just blue screens, like completely crashes.
Exactly. And how does a rigidly throttled system handle a buffer overflow? It throws an error code.
An error code.
It labels the complex thinker as broken. It tells them they are overthinking or decides they suddenly need performance management.
Oh, performance management, the kiss of death.
Right. This system actively rejects the complex data packet to maintain what Kristen calls pathological homeostasis.
Pathological homeostasis. I want to stay on this concept for a second because it is so recognizable.
It really is.
If you're listening to this on your commute to a corporate job, you have probably seen this exact phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the last time you were in a major strategy meeting and someone brought up a glaring, massive flaw in a project. A flaw that could literally derail the whole thing.
Yeah.
And instead of addressing it, what did the manager say? They said, let's take that offline, or let's put that in the parking lot document.
The parking lot document where ideas go to die.
Exactly. The system prefers to be comfortably sick rather than uncomfortably cured.
That is the absolute essence of it. The institution forces the individual into a shut-up state.
A shut-up state.
And the tragedy here is the sheer amount of cognitive load that is wasted.
Oh, I bet.
When a hyper-threaded mind is forced into pathological homeostasis, it burns vast amounts of its own processing power just managing the suppression.
Because you're constantly monitoring yourself.
Right. The tiger spends all her energy pretending to be the house cat, making sure she doesn't accidentally show her teeth or move too fast.
Which means her actual phenomenal talent is completely lost to the organization. They're paying for a tiger and forcing her to purr. So if she is wasting all this processing power pretending, what happens when she actually applies it to her field of expertise? Because her field as an actuary is literal ruin.
Yes.
When you have a hyper-threaded CPU, you don't just see the immediate tasks on your desk. You see the entire timeline of a system stretching years into the future.
Which brings us perfectly to ruin theory.
Okay, let's get into it.
So ruin theory is a fascinating, highly complex area of mathematics. It is often applied in actuarial science to calculate the probability that an insurer's surplus will drop below zero.
So, simply put, it is the math of going broke.
Yes. The formal definition involves calculating stochastic processes near an absorbing barrier.
Hold on, let me stop you. Stochastic processes near an absorbing barrier. In plain English, does that just mean she can do the math on how close a random, unpredictable walk is getting to a cliff edge from which it can't return?
That is a brilliant translation, yes.
Okay, great.
The absorbing barrier is the cliff. Once you hit it, the game is over. You are ruined.
And The stochastic process.
The stochastic process is the unpredictable path the company takes as it moves forward in time. It's the daily ups and downs, the random events.
I see.
But Krista's application of this theory goes far beyond just insurance payouts. She notes a foundational truth. Ruined paths begin before recognition.
Ruined paths begin before recognition.
Right. We are conditioned to think that a collapse begins when the numbers go red.
Right. We think the crisis starts when the stock plummets or when the pension fund officially runs out of money.
But Christie points out that collapse rarely begins numerically. The math is just a lagging indicator.
A lagging indicator. So what's the leading indicator?
The ruin begins with coordination strain. It begins with narrative distortion.
Narrative distortion, like people lying.
Yes, where people start lying to themselves and their bosses just to keep the dashboards looking green. It begins with trust decay between departments.
Oh, wow.
By the time the failure actually reaches the spreadsheet, the ruined path is already fully formed. It is often mathematically irreversible by the time management notices the red numbers.
That is terrifying. She has this framework where she applies hurricane modeling to human capital, which I think completely redefines how we look at organizations.
It's one of her most powerful analogies.
She treats companies like atmospheric systems. Just listen to how she frames this. Burnout isn't a personality flaw. It's sustained heat without dissipation.
And she builds on that. She says, turnover isn't a lack of culture fit, it's energy escaping a pressure gradient.
Energy escaping a pressure gradient. I love that.
Right. Misemployment is friction from misaligned force vectors. Incentives are pressure systems. Culture is emergent weather under constraint.
When you look at an organization as a weather system, a Category 5 storm doesn't just form because someone in accounting had a bad attitude.
No, of course not.
It forms because of immense systemic pressures that had nowhere to vent. But, I need to challenge how she applies this to her own life.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, there's very interesting detail in her personal timeline in the dataset. She walked away from a Navy ROTC scholarship at MIT in 2004.
That's right.
And then later, in 2008, she walked away from a fully funded theoretical statistics PhD program at the University of Florida.
Yes, she did.
Now, the standard corporate narrative, that singular axis receiver we talked about, would look at dropping out of MIT and call it a massive failure.
They absolutely would.
How does she view this as a mathematical success?
She addresses this directly, and it is the absolute core of her personal application of ruin theory.
Okay.
She states, quitting isn't failure. It's what you do when you recognize a ruined path.
Wow.
Remember, because of her multi-axis processing, she sees the timeline. She understands those stochastic processes. And she knows that the most dangerous, deceptive ruin paths are the ones that are locally stable.
Locally stable, meaning right now in this exact 5-foot radius, everything looks completely fine.
Better than fine. Performance compounds, credentials accumulate, variance appears entirely contained.
So she looked like a huge success on paper.
Exactly. To the outside world, to her peers, she was on a rocket ship to prestige and success.
But she saw the cliff.
She looked at the underlying architecture of those educational and career paths and saw that they were structurally doomed. She noted that she refused to specialize in layers of work that were about to abstract themselves away.
Wow.
She dropped out of MIT because she saw that enduring human capability wasn't going to be about memorizing programming syntax.
Right.
It was going to be about pattern recognition, judgment under ambiguity, and nonlinear thinking.
So her quitting was actually a highly advanced risk mitigation strategy.
Yes.
She was stepping off a train that everyone else thought was going to the top of the mountain because she had done the math and calculated that the tracks ended in a cliff 10 miles ahead.
That is exactly how she saw it. She understood that if you stay on a locally stable path that is structurally doomed, your ruin is mathematically guaranteed.
Mathematically guaranteed.
Quitting was the only way to preserve her capability and avoid the absorbing barrier.
That completely flips the script on what quitting means. But it brings up a huge question for me.
What's that?
If ruin theory tells us that these collapses are visible long before the numbers go red,
Yeah.
and if people with high esoteric buy traits can see these atmospheric weather patterns forming years in advance, why don't corporate leadership teams see it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why do these massive resource-rich institutions with thousands of employees and millions of dollars in consulting fees just sail right off the cliff?
According to Christie, it is because they are entirely blinded by the dashboard.
Blinded by the dashboard.
And this brings us to the conceptual centerpiece of her analysis, the pink duck theory.
Okay, I want to slow down and really look at what this theory actually means in practice.
So the pink duck theory draws on the public relations concepts of Edward Bernays and the economic principle of Goodhart's law.
Okay, remind me what Goodhart's law is.
Goodhart's law essentially states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Right, because people start gaming the metric instead of doing the actual work.
Exactly. But Christie takes this further. She notes that once the scoreboard replaces the game, anything that is not actively tracked on the scoreboard literally stops being real to the institution.
Wow, it stops being real.
Yes.
Let's walk through the pink duck logic, because it explains perfectly how massive systems go blind.
Go ahead.
Imagine an institutional model. This could be an AI hiring filter, a corporate risk dashboard, or, an algorithmic loan approval system. The model is presented with a duck.
Right.
But this specific duck happens to be pink. Now, the model doesn't consciously, maliciously misclassify the pink duck.
No, it's not evil.
It's much worse than that. The model has completely forgotten that the color pink even exists.
Yes, pink was not in its original training data. Pink is not a permitted variable.
Exactly. The institutional template only knows how to ask one binary question. Is it a duck?
And the system looks at the shape, the feathers, the beak, and the answer is yes.
Yes, it's a duck.
Yeah.
So the template auto-fills the color category as yellow.
Autofills to yellow. Why? Because yellow is the only value the model is programmed to output.
It literally overwrites reality.
When a system cannot represent a variable, it treats that variable as if it is non-existent.
So this pink duck moves through the entire corporate pipeline. Duck, yes. Color.
Yeah.
Not measured. Therefore, auto-filled to yellow.
Right.
And then, at the end of the quarter, the executive leadership team looks at the aggregated data set. And the dataset confirms what the template assumed all along. 100% of the ducks we encountered were yellow.
It creates its own reality.
Not because there are no pink ducks in the real world,
No.
but because the system systematically eliminated its own ability to see them.
And we have to make a very crucial distinction here. Do not confuse a pink duck with a black swan.
Oh, that's a good point.
A black swan, popularized by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in risk theory, is an unforeseeable, highly improbable event with massive, catastrophic consequences.
Right, it's an unknown unknown.
Exactly. It's fundamentally unknowable until it actually happens. But a pink duck is entirely different. A pink duck is an anomaly that is highly visible to anyone who is actually paying attention. It is a known unknown, but it is socially and systemically discounted.
It's the correlation that obviously won't hold under stress, just sitting right there in the footnotes of the quarterly financial report.
Yes.
It's the massive incentive misalignment that every single junior employee in the break room complains about, but no one ever puts in the official strategy deck.
Precisely. Everyone can see it, but no one logs it.
I have to stop you there, though, because I need to challenge this whole pink duck idea.
Okay, challenge away.
Look, corporations aren't stupid. They are inherently profit-driven entities, right?
Right.
If ignoring a pink duck, ignoring a massive structural flaw is going to cost the company millions of dollars in the long run, why wouldn't a rational middle manager just point it out?
That's the logical assumption.
Wouldn't they want to get promoted for saving the company from a disaster? Capitalism doesn't usually just leave money on the table out of sheer stubbornness.
That is a very logical question, but it completely ignores the reality of internal corporate incentive structures.
Okay, explain.
You are assuming the middle manager's primary motivation is the long-term abstract survival of the company.
And it isn't.
It isn't. Their primary motivation is their own immediate career survival.
Oh, right.
Taking a pink duck seriously is wildly expensive politically.
Politically expensive. How so?
Think about the chain reaction of admitting the duck is pink.
Okay.
If the duck is pink, then the multi-million-dollar dashboard model the company just bought is wrong.
Nice.
If the model is wrong, then the prior approvals and budget allocations made by the senior vice president based on that model are wrong.
Double yikes.
And if those prior approvals are wrong, then budgets must be clawed back, projects must be halted, and corporate hierarchies will violently shift.
Wow. So pointing out the pink duck threatens the entire power structure.
Exactly. You aren't just pointing out a data error, you are pointing out that your boss's boss made a fundamental mistake.
And no one wants to do that.
Career risk supersedes company risk. As long as the perceived probability of an immediate regime shift, a total, undeniably public collapse remains below a certain social threshold, the absolute lowest cost move for middle management is to just dismiss the pink duck.
Just ignore it.
And Christie points out that humor becomes a nonlinear solution for this.
Humor, like making jokes.
Yes. People make jokes about the pink duck in meetings to lower the tension, to restore social coordination, and to subtly signal to each other that the stable regime still holds.
Hey, isn't it crazy that the back-end server is held together with duct tape?
Right. They laugh it off so they don't have to fix it.
But the laws of mathematics and physics don't care if you laugh off a structural flaw.
You know they don't.
The ruin path is still compounding in the background? So if the system stubbornly refuses to see the pink duck, and leadership is staring happily at a dashboard full of auto-filled yellow ducks, what happens to the people inside the organization who do see the pink ducks?
What happens to the tigers trapped in the cubicles?
Exactly. What happens to them?
This leads us to Christie's concept of the canaries, or what she formally calls dandy doodle duckies.
Dandy doodle duckies. That's quite a name.
She abbreviates it as DDDs. These are descent detection devices.
Descent detection devices. The human beings who operate as the early warning sensors for the institution.
Yes. In any complex organization, there are always a few individuals who possess that high esoteric bite trait. They notice things long before the dashboards do.
Right. They are the ones who hear the odd, subtle vibration in the engine.
They spot the strained, cascading pattern in the messy data sets.
They are the ones asking the deeply uncomfortable questions in the all-hands meetings, while all the key performance indicators still look beautifully green.
But we just established that the system hates uncomfortable questions because they threaten the political hierarchy.
Right. So what is the cost of dissent? Because the source material points out something very counterintuitive. The system usually doesn't fire these dissent detection devices.
No, they don't. Firing them outright would be a documented event. It would require HR paperwork, performance improvement plans, and it would cause overt friction.
And institutions hate overt friction.
Institutions prefer quiet compliance over loud conflict. Instead, the duckies simply migrate.
They migrate. They leave on their own.
Dissent becomes socially and professionally exhausting. Their signals get constantly filtered out or tone policed by management.
Tone policed. You're being too negative.
Exactly. It becomes overwhelmingly clear to the canary that maintaining the narrative is more important to the company than investigating anomalies. And when the psychological cost of speaking truth exceeds the individual's capacity to absorb that cost, they leave.
They quit. They walk away from the locally stable ruin path, just like Christine did at MIT.
Yes.
And the terrifying part for the company is that the dashboards still look green after they leave.
The dashboards don't notice.
The executives probably think, oh, great, we lost a negative complainer, our culture is improving. But what actually happened mathematically is that the system just quietly lost its only early warning sensors.
Christine delves into the heavy mechanics of this using two concepts, the sensing theorem and the Shannon inversion.
Okay, let's break those down.
The sensing theorem essentially states that an organization's effective sensing capability is not defined by how many dashboards or data points you have.
What is it defined by?
It is defined by how much signal actually survives the organization's suppression mechanisms.
Oh, wow.
Effective sensing collapses entirely when suppression rises. You can have perfect human sensors on the front lines, but if the pathway to the decision makers is blocked by narrative smoothing middle management, the system is functionally blind.
I want to follow that thread into the Shannon inversion. Claude Shannon is famously known as the father of information theory, right?
Yes, he mathematically modeled communication channels, signals, and noise.
But Christie points out a massive blind spot in his original work.
What did he miss?
He didn't model human incentives.
Yes. The foundational assumption of the information age was that signals lived inside feedback loops where being accurate actually had real-world consequences for the sender.
Right. But Christie identifies the Shannon inversion. This is the toxic state where signal producers are completely insulated from the consequences of being wrong.
That's a huge shift.
Let me give a relatable example of this. Think of a CEO demanding a new, highly experimental AI chatbot for customer service because a consulting firm told them it would save 20% on overhead.
Happens every day.
The CEO implements it, but the CEO never has to use the bot.
Right.
They don't experience the hallucinated answers. They don't have to field the calls from furious customers whose accounts were logged.
They are completely insulated.
The CEO is entirely insulated from the friction. So to them, the dashboard metric looks great. Great costs are technically down, even while the underlying customer trust and system integrity decays.
That is the Shannon inversion in action. And when authority is insulated like that, noise becomes incredibly cheap to produce.
Tube noise.
Attention outruns validation. Volume beats accuracy. Noise scales exponentially faster than truth.
And when uncertainty grows faster than an organization can coordinate around reality, the collapse shifts from a possibility to a mechanical certainty.
At this point, we need to explicitly mention a broader application of Christie's work found in the source material.
Yeah, we should cover that.
She doesn't just apply this systems-level diagnosis to HR departments or corporate boards. She scales it up to examine broader societal and institutional collapse.
Right.
In the text, she mentions the Yarvin Vance neo-reactionary framework.
Yes. For context, and to be very clear, without endorsing the framework itself, Christie notes that the core tenet of this neo-reactionary philosophy is operating as an active philosophy inside certain powerful institutions.
Right, the idea that the administrative state operates as a self-perpetuating ideology rather than a functional governance structure.
She points out that there are individuals in power who have accepted the premise that the current system is fundamentally compromised and that collapse is being operationalized.
And we need to explicitly state to you, the listener, that in exploring this deep dive, we are not endorsing or validating these specific political ideologies, neither left-wing nor right-wing.
Absolutely not. We are strictly and impartially reporting on Christie's mathematical and structural observation.
We are looking at the math of the collapse, not taking a political side. She is looking at how systemic demoralization and the Shannon inversion are being utilized at the highest levels of institutional architecture.
Exactly. It is a diagnosis of system mechanics, not a political endorsement.
And whether you are looking at a macro society or a mid-sized insurance firm, the suppression of the canaries isn't just an abstract data problem. It happens on a deeply personal, psychological level.
It really does.
It happens in the human resources department. It happens through the systematic reduction of brilliant, complex minds into a simple excuse.
Let's transition into that because the tension between Christie's specific neurodivergence, her autism and ADHD hardware and corporate HR is profound.
It's a huge part of her story.
Christie points out a mechanism that happens in almost every modern workplace. Institutions almost never frame correction as correction anymore.
Historically, institutional correction of nonconformity was brutal, overt, and public.
Right.
Today, the tools of suppression are much softer, which paradoxically makes them much harder to fight.
How does that work?
Well, if you have an esoteric by trait that threatens the established narrative, HR doesn't pull you into an office and say, you are too smart, you see too much, and it scares us.
No, they would never say that.
They frame it as a deficiency. They say, we need to put you on performance management.
Or, we have concerns about your communication style.
Or they use the ultimate unprovable catch-all, you just aren't a culture fit.
Ah, culture fit. The intervention is always described as responding to a legitimate problem with the individual, rather than what it actually is, enforcing a behavioral norm to protect the hierarchy.
They frame it as a personal failing so the company doesn't have to admit they are suppressing a valid predictive signal.
Christie frames this conflict using a very poignant sci-fi reference, Solok's crushing.
Yes. In the lore she references, a character named Solok was physically crushed by purists simply for being a hybrid.
Just for being different.
In the modern corporate world, the verified generalist, the person who can seamlessly connect engineering realities with financial constraints, HR policies, and macro strategy, is crushed by specialized corporate silos.
Because the institutional gods demand standard nodes.
They demand standardized yellow ducks.
If you try to act as the context architecture for the company, if you try to unite disparate fields and show how the whole system is drifting toward a cliff, they will drop a mountain on you.
Which brings up a very painful reality about human capital.
What's that?
If these people, these verified generalists, these tigers with hurricane-level processing power are so incredibly smart, why do they let themselves be flattened?
That is a great question.
Why do they stay in the cubicle and pretend to be house cats?
Right. If you can clearly see the ruin path and you know the system is going to punish you for pointing it out, why subject yourself to Solok's crushing? Why not just fight back with the data?
Because of the immense cognitive cost of legibility.
The cost of legibility.
Christie explains that the people most likely to detect structural instability, the long horizon processors, the pattern-first thinkers, are inherently the least legible to the corporate sponsorship architecture.
Meaning they don't look like future executives.
Exactly. The corporate transmission system only rewards institutional compatibility. It rewards sponsorable profiles.
Executives sponsor people who look, think, and talk like them.
So the system doesn't evaluate the quality of the work first. It evaluates whether the person delivering the work is legible and comfortable to the system.
And Christie's multi-axis processing doesn't compress into a format the system recognizes as safe.
So to survive, they mask.
They mask.
They perform compatibility. They translate their massive, highly nuanced 4K downloads into a safe, linear, bullet point format just so they won't be rejected by management.
But this creates a catastrophic epistemic infrastructure problem for the institution itself.
How so?
Think about it. The system is systematically manufacturing high-capacity operators who are forced to attenuate and degrade their own signal before it ever reaches the decision-making level.
Wow. They are hedging their own correct conclusions.
Yes, they are over-verifying things they already know to be mathematically true, watering down their warnings just so they sound normal to a VP.
Which means the CEO, the board of directors, the people steering the ship, they never, ever see the undegraded truth.
The signal is degraded upstream by the very people trying to save the company,
Correct.
because the company routinely penalizes the raw truth.
Christie adds a deeply personal and insightful layer to this dynamic from her perspective as a lesbian woman.
Oh, this part of the analysis is brilliant.
She discusses the concept of compulsory heterosexuality not just as a social dynamic, but as an information distortion system.
I want to focus on this because mapping a personal identity onto a corporate data dynamic is just. It's a completely novel way to look at it. How does she connect the two?
She notes that compulsory heterosexuality essentially trains people from a very young age to actively override their own internal signals in favor of adopting external scripts.
Okay.
You feel one way, your internal ground truth is undeniable, but society hands you a script that says you must act, feel, and present another way.
Right.
So you are forced to distort your own internal reality to match the external demand just to survive socially.
And she argues that this exact same distortion dynamic shows up in corporate culture.
Yes. Incentive structures constantly override ground truth. Reputation hierarchies substitute for actual evidence. Consensus narratives mask structural misalignment.
The company tells you the project is a massive success even when your internal metrics, your own eyes, tell you it's failing.
But here is the profound advantage of her background. She notes that if you have learned very early in life that the dominant social scripts can be fundamentally objectively wrong because they directly contradict your undeniable internal reality, you are much less likely to confuse social alignment with structural validity in the workplace.
Yes. She says that's not oppositional, it's calibration.
Exactly. Because she had to calibrate to her own internal ground truth to survive socially, she automatically calibrates to ground truth in the data, regardless of what the corporate consensus script says.
She flat out refuses to override her internal signal just because the dashboard is painted green.
And this constant, exhausting battle between ground truth and the corporate narrative isn't just a quirky workplace issue about finding fulfillment.
No, it's not.
It is a mathematical countdown to ruin. And as we transition into the age of artificial intelligence, this dynamic becomes exponentially more dangerous.
I want to introduce a brilliant anecdote Christie shares about a children's game played in Minnesota. It perfectly illustrates this AI transition.
Duck, duck, gray duck.
Yes, duck, duck, gray duck. Now, I grew up playing duck, duck, goose, like most people. You sit in a circle, someone walks around tapping heads saying duck, 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 and then suddenly yells, goose, and the chase is on.
Right. In Duck, Duck, Goose, the signal is incredibly obvious. Everyone knows the exact moment the regime shifts.
The rules of the game change the exact second. The word goose is yelled. There is zero ambiguity.
But in Minnesota, they played Duck, Duck, Gray Duck.
Yeah. The person walks around tapping heads saying red duck, blue duck, green duck, and eventually, with no changing cadence, says gray duck.
And that subtle difference changes the entire cognitive strategy of the game.
Because in gray duck, the signal is ambiguous. You don't know the regime has shifted until the runner is already moving away from you.
The signal appears before action is totally rational or obvious to the group.
Exactly. Christie applies this perfectly to organizational failure. Most organizations think they are playing duck, duck, goose.
They think they can afford to wait for a clear, obvious, universally recognized signal.
A blaring red dashboard, a massive drop in quarterly earnings. They think they'll have time to react.
But reality is duck, duck, gray duck. The real world doesn't yell goose.
The real world gives you a pink duck. It gives you a subtle anomaly.
It gives you a gray duck interval where evidence of change is visible to those paying attention, but the threshold for safe, consensus-driven decision-making hasn't been crossed yet.
And most catastrophic institutional failures happen right in that middle zone, when the signal is visible, but the model says, keep tapping ducks.
By the time the metric officially turns red, the decision point is miles behind you.
So to understand how artificial intelligence fundamentally exacerbates this gray duck problem, we need to look at Christie's formula for the AI era.
It's C multiplied by D must be less than or equal to J.
C times D is less than or equal to J. Let's translate the variables for everyone listening.
Sure. Capability multiplied by dependency must be less than or equal to judgment formation.
Capability is what the system, the AI, can now do.
Right. Dependency is how deeply our organizational workflows rely on that AI to function.
And judgment formation is whether the humans in the loop are still actually building real expertise, intuition, and pattern recognition.
This is the absolute equation for systemic stability.
But modern organizations are violently violating this inequality.
Violently violating.
They are rapidly expanding AI capability. They are deepening their dependency on it to save money. But human judgment is thinning out at an alarming rate.
Why is it thinning out?
Because the apprentices are no longer struggling. Junior employees are using AI to generate their code, their reports, and their analysis.
Which means they are no longer building the internal cognitive models required to detect when the system drifts.
Right. Kristen calls this responsibility drift. We are hollowing out performance.
The variance narrows, everything looks cleaner and faster, the board of directors relaxes because costs are down, but the internal human expertise is silently decaying.
So AI isn't an assistant like they tell us.
No, Kristen offers a stark warning about corporate AI. It is almost always pitched in press releases as a benevolent assistant.
Sold as a tool to empower employees.
But Christie's structural analysis reveals it is often an efficiency trap. It is designed to automate the human out, or at the very least, to brutally enforce the safest, most standardized yellow duck consensus possible.
It's the ultimate singular axis receiver.
Yes. It doesn't want your esoteric byte trait. It wants to dry out your complex thinking so it can store it in rigid, safety-aligned boxes.
When organizations treat human capital merely as a list of discrete skills that can be automated by a language model, rather than recognizing it as the accumulated judgment needed to notice system drift, they're literally destroying their only defense against ruin.
They are firing the canaries and replacing them with algorithms that only know how to output yellow ducks.
If we synthesize the journey we've taken through Christie O'Neill's system architecture today, the picture is incredibly clear.
It is. We began by looking at a true tiger in Zootopia, a neurodivergent mind possessing a hyper-threaded CPU capable of massive architectural downloads and hurricane-level risk modeling.
And we saw how that tiger is forced to navigate a throttled, dial-up corporate environment that just wants her to be a standardized, sponsorable yellow duck.
We explored how her human OS inherently refuses to downscale, allowing her to see the ruin paths, the locally stable train wrecks, long before the numbers turn red.
We examined the tragedy of the pink duck theory, how systems systematically eliminate their ability to see anomalies because acknowledging them threatens the political hierarchy.
And we saw the inevitable result. The dandy doodle duckies, the dissent detection devices, are forced to migrate away from the noise, leaving the organization blind, comfortable, and doomed.
We want to ask you, the listener, to really reflect on your own environment. Look around your workplace.
Are you attending to the pink ducks?
When someone with a high esoteric byte trait points out a correlation that obviously won't hold under stress, do you listen? Or do you put it in the parking lot document?
Or are you, perhaps, one of the migrating canaries packing your bags right now because the system has made the psychological cost of your dissent far too expensive to bear?
It is a critical question of systemic resilience for any leader.
Are you building a culture that can actually absorb and metabolize uncomfortable ground truth? Or are you just demanding pathological homeostasis?
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Yeah.
Something that builds on everything Christie has laid out. Something for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
We know that modern, massive institutions are aggressively filtering out these neurodivergent dissent detection devices.
We know they're forcing the verified generalists to mask and attenuate their signals.
And we know they are simultaneously using those highly filtered, yellow duck-only corporate data sets to train the next generation of artificial general intelligence.
So the question becomes, are we mathematically hard-coding an AI that is permanently structurally blind to pink ducks?
Will our ultimate technological achievement simply be the flawless, frictionless, and fully automated execution of our own ruin path?
Think about it. We'll see you next time.